Welcome back to SMWX, Spread the Fire. I'm here again talking about coalitions, the outcomes of the 2024 election. So let's get into it. The elections are over and South Africa is officially in a new period of transition, I would say. 30 years after the turn to democracy, 30 years after our democratic transition, I would say we are now entering a new phase of transition. It's likely to be a long one, a drawn-out one, and it will only become clear, really, over time. But let's keep in mind that what we've witnessed does now signal a new sort of transition in South Africa. The one transition that started a few years ago, though, I would say in 2016, was a transition to coalition governments. 2016 local government elections was the first time that we saw a shift towards coalition governments at a local level. And now we see that that has played out on a national level this time round. What we saw in 2016 will have a lot of bearing on the discussion that we have now and what we've seen since in terms of coalition governments. So now since 2016, 2021, we now have a new period of national and provincial coalition governments. There are a lot of new faces that we're going to see in these national and provincial assemblies and government. So yeah, I think the basic point here is that there's a transition going on. That transition will take time to play out, but what we are seeing is a continuation of what started in 2016 in terms of moving towards coalition governments. Partly this has been inevitable in the South African political system, with both the steady decline of the ANC over time and the way our political system has been set up, as well as no new political player that has come on and actually threatened to take above 50% of the electoral vote. This is kind of what has led to this. So then, of course, coalitions are on the tip of everyone's tongue. Everyone's talking about coalitions, about possible agreements, about negotiations, about negotiation teams. And this has been the conversation really since it became clear what those election results would be and that the ANC would fall significantly below 50% or 51% that is required. There are a few options that we heard about before this election that are now gone. The most prominent one is, of course, the multi-party charter or the Moonshot Pact. And as we know, the ANC and DA are going to be entering into coalition negotiations. So that means that the multi-party charter is gone, in addition to the fact that it just didn't get enough support from the electorate. But other than that major one that was talked about a lot before the elections, the other options are still mostly on the table. An ANC-DA coalition, an ANC-EFF coalition, and an ANC-MK coalition, or a combination of those. The one thing about the ANC-EFF coalition is that it has to slightly change the terms of that just because of the electoral results, right? So if the EFF has, as we have seen, the EFF has dropped its support a little bit and the ANC is sitting at about 40%, that means that they cannot enter into a coalition negotiation on their own, so it would require other partners involved in that. The DA and MK have, of course, emerged strongly from this election, although the DA didn't grow in leaps and bounds, but they have put themselves in a position where they can be part of the coalition negotiations in a very central way. And of course, the MK's dramatic showing at the polls has put them in the conversation too after this election. So the ANC is still the majority party, and that's why it's involved in all of these coalition talks and arrangements. But it is severely weakened, and it comes into the negotiations from a weakened position. And then, of course, parties like the IFP and a range of smaller parties are still in the conversation in one way or another right now. There's still a lot that's up in the air. I mean, we have 2 weeks to go to a sitting of the National Assembly, and until then, there's going to be a lot of conversation that involves these. And I will say one thing on the smaller parties. I think we're going to see a greater representation of smaller parties in the upcoming National Assembly. There's a lot more seats that have been divvied up to smaller parties. And I mean, hopefully that will bring in a range of new, fresh ideas to the National Assembly that can only really make that a more vibrant space if it is that they bring in new ideas. Nonetheless, they're still part of the conversation somehow in this, and of course the IFP. So I want to talk about just how we look at 2016 and the local government elections and the coalitions that were formed in 2016 and 2021 and take that into the national conversation. So I think the most important point to underline here for me is that a national government coalition cannot be formed on an ad hoc basis, nor can it be formed using the kind of problematic principles that we've seen local government coalitions being formed on, right? So, one of the problems with local government coalitions has been that conversations about position and influence in local government have shaped um, the coalition negotiations in very important ways, often more so than what is a stable government, what is stable governance and policy, and what does that look like. So I think that's an important point to underline here is that a national coalition has to be formed in a different way, right? Because there are major policy discussions that need to come into it. There are also major conversations about positions that will need to come into it, right? So I think the negotiations are going to be more complicated because of that. But they also need to take into consideration the experience of the local government coalitions and the critiques that have been put out in the public about those coalitions when going into the current set of negotiations, right? I will say this, parties have been a lot less coy about negotiations than they were in 2016, for example, where there was a whole lot of talking around the issue of coalitions and how you enter into them. There have been many parties now that have stated what their non negotiables are, what they would like to go into a coalition with, who they would like to go into a coalition with, and so there's a lot less talking around the situation. I think it's confirmed. Coalitions are where we're headed, and a lot of the major parties want in on those coalitions, right? So that's an important change. They've also changed some of their pre-electoral conditions for coalitions. So there were some non-negotiables that were put out. Some parties even saying that they would never go into a coalition with the ANC, who have since changed their position now to saying that they would consider a coalition agreement with the ANC. And let's just remember, we're talking about a national coalition and a number of potential provincial coalitions, and that will be part of the negotiations. So from there, I don't want to talk to specific coalition examples or scenarios. I think lots of people are talking about them, and I did mention some of them earlier. But I just want to talk more generally about some of what has been put on the table, some of what is being talked about around this period of coalition negotiations. So the government of national unity idea has come up. It has apparently been supported by some prominent political figures and some within the ANC, including veterans of the ANC. We have to look really to history for the example of a government of national unity. And of course, we're looking to 1994. My issue with this is that as much as I think we should look at the history of the government of national unity, just like we should look at the history of coalitions over the last 30 years, provincial and the local government coalitions, that I think we need to also understand how different the context is in relation to the idea of a government of national unity now. The first is that 1994 was a point of transition, a point of democratic transition. But on top of that, this is the first time in 30 years that the ANC does not enter into government not having a majority of the votes. So those are important differences, right? There's also a very different political climate that we're dealing with here. So that idea has come up, and we'll see where the idea of a government of national unity goes. What it would mean, I think, or what is being referred to when you speak about a government of national unity, is multiple parties coming in to forming government, positions being taken up by multiple parties, not just a single party, and perhaps not even two parties. And then there's the question of Parliament or the National Assembly, and then the executive branch of government. And of course, we've heard in relation to some of the coalition negotiations, particularly around the DA, that there might be a possibility that the DA would take the Speaker of Parliament, and then, do that coalition on an issue-by-issue basis, an agreement, I would say, rather than a full coalition. So that would be a minority ANC government with the vote of the DA to form a government, and then dealing with it on an issue-by-issue basis. And then the other idea that's come in is perhaps splitting between Parliament and the executive. So who would get the Speaker of Parliament role, and portfolio committees and so on in Parliament might come into that. The other thing is that I think we should be wary of any position, any coalition that is being touted as the only option or the only workable or viable option. I think what we have now are a number of options on the table, but we also have heard that for example, this group of people prefers this coalition, or for example, the market forces prefer an ANC-DA coalition. And I think, it's very important that we debate as a public, although we're not involved in the negotiations, the merits and demerits of all of these potential coalition negotiations, right? What that means for ethical leadership, what it means for policy positions, what it means for dealing with things like the jobs crisis, inequality in this country, dealing with things like femicide and gender-based violence, and these very real issues that we have in South Africa, right? So I think we should be able to debate the merits and demerits of each of those coalitions, not solely dictated by one consideration around a coalition. And of course, the coalition negotiations are going to be a balance of discussions around positions and discussions around policy positions, right? But this idea that there is only one workable option or one viable option, I think we need to debate the options that we have at the moment and see how these negotiations for agreements progress. Last thing on coalitions. The agreements that are set out now as the new National Assembly is formed and sworn in, as the new government is formed, I think will set the tone for where we will be 5 years from now when we have the next national and provincial election. I think how parties go into the coalition, how the agreements are shaped in the coalition, will really dictate the future fortunes of the major parties involved in those. And I think particularly when it comes to the ANC, what happens now with the coalition will have a very significant bearing on the next election and how they fare in it, and whether this decline will continue. Of course, the performance in government is a major part of this and the key kind of issues that will come up closer to the election. But I do think this lays the foundation of what's to come for the political parties involved. They will also have to then position themselves in those coalitions and in those agreements in a way that they see benefits their political parties over the next 5 years. It would be unreasonable to think that they would go into coalitions purely on an altruistic level. They will be thinking about how their political parties will fare over time and over the next 5 years. Okay, and here's my parting shot from the 2024 election, is that democracy in politics is not just about elections, it's not just about voting, there's much more to it. And I think the next 5 years will show how we can all get involved in those broader processes and deeper processes of democracy and politics. Thank you.